8 months from now, the agreement that is keeping your smartphone factories running, your F-35 jets flying, your electric vehicles moving, and your defense missiles guided, that agreement expires November 10th, 2026. That is the date China set when it agreed to temporarily pause its stranglehold on the minerals. That power essentially everything in the modern world, not permanently, not as a gesture of goodwill for exactly 1 year, as a tactical pause, while it figures out its next move. And right now, as of this week, March 2026, American companies are still running short, still scrambling, still telling industry insiders that supply is not getting to manufacturers, still waiting on Chinese export licenses that Beijing is deliberately slow walking even during the so-called truce period. That is not a truce, that is a demonstration. China is showing the United States exactly what a world without Chinese rare earths looks like, and it is showing it right now during the easy period while the formal ban is still suspended. Think about what happens when the ban comes back. If you think this is a story about minerals, about geology and chemistry and obscure elements you have never heard of, you are about to find out how wrong that assumption is. This is a story about who controls the technology that runs the 21st century. This is a story about a pattern that has been building for 40 years in plain sight. And this is a story about what happens to your savings, your investments, and the economy. Your retirement depends on when the chokehold tightens. 17 elements. China controls 70% of global mining output and over 80% of global processing capacity for these 17 elements. They are in your phone, your laptop, your car, your solar panels, your wind turbines, the magnets in every electric motor made anywhere on Earth, the guidance systems in every precision missile in the U.S. arsenal. Without them, the technology economy does not slow down. It stops, and China just proved twice in the past year that it is completely willing to turn off the tap. This is not a warning, it already happened. The supply cuts are already causing what industry insiders this week called severe challenges for defense and tech manufacturers. The Pentagon is already in emergency stockpiling mode. J.P. Morgan just announced a $1.5 trillion Security and Resiliency Initiative specifically because Jamie Dimon said it had become, and these are his exact words, painfully clear that the United States has allowed itself to become too reliant on unreliable sources of critical minerals. The largest bank in America, $1.5 trillion emergency mode, and the clock is running toward November. Stay with me, because what I am about to show you is not speculation. It is a pattern, a mechanism, a system that has repeated itself across decades of documented history with almost mechanical precision. And once you see it, every headline about China, every trade war announcement, every rare earth export license delay, it will snap into focus immediately. I call it the resource monopoly cycle, for stages always in the same order, always producing the same outcome. Stage 1 is quiet accumulation. This is where it begins. A rising power identifies a resource that the existing dominant power depends on or will depend on. It does not announce its intentions. It does not make speeches. It quietly, systematically, over decades, corners the global supply of that resource. It subsidizes domestic production until foreign competitors cannot match the price. It tolerates environmental damage that Western nations cannot politically accept. It builds processing infrastructure that is so capital-intensive and technically complex that no competitor can replicate it quickly. It makes itself indispensable before anyone notices it has done so. Stage 2 is the first test. Once the monopoly is established, the dominant power tests its leverage, not with a full embargo, with a targeted restriction applied to a specific country over a specific dispute, calibrated precisely enough to inflict pain, ambiguous enough to maintain deniability. The message is sent, the world takes. Note, the dominant power learns exactly where the leverage actually lies. Stage 3 is the chokehold. The restrictions expand. What began as targeted pressure becomes systematic control. Export licensing requirements, technology transfer bans, personnel restrictions preventing Chinese nationals from sharing processing knowledge abroad. The supply chain that the world built on the assumption of cheap, reliable access becomes a hostage to Beijing's strategic calculations. Companies scramble, governments panic, stockpiles deplete. The target economy discovers that decades of dependence cannot be reversed in months or years. Stage 4 is the extraction of concessions. This is what it was always about, not the minerals themselves, the leverage, the ability to demand and receive political, economic, and strategic concessions from nations that need access to the supply, trade deals rewritten, technology transfer agreements signed, geopolitical alignments adjusted. The dominant power that built its position through military and economic strength finds itself negotiating from a position of structural weakness with a rival that never fired a shot. For stages, the same sequence every time. Let me prove it. The year is 1992. Deng Xiaoping, the architect of modern China, visits a rare earth mining operation in Inner Mongolia. He makes a statement that Chinese officials have repeated for 30 years since: the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. That statement was not a boast. It was a strategy, a 40-year plan announced in public that the Western world heard and did not believe. China at that point controlled a significant share of global rare earth production. Within 2 decades, through deliberate industrial policy, massive state subsidies, and a willingness to absorb environmental costs that American and European regulators would never accept, that share would exceed 70% of global mining and 80% of global processing. The United States, meanwhile, was doing the opposite. Mountain Pass, California, once the largest rare earth mine in the world, shut down its processing operations in 2002, unable to compete with subsidized Chinese prices. America went from self-sufficient to 90% import dependent in a single decade. Stage 1. Complete, executed exactly as announced in public over 40 years, while the West watched, check, verified, undeniable. The year is 2010. A Chinese fishing trawler collides with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the disputed Senkaku Islands. Japan arrests the Chinese captain. What followed was not a diplomatic note, not a strongly worded statement. China cut rare earth exports to Japan by approximately 60% within weeks. Japan had no alternative suppliers. Its entire electronics and automotive manufacturing sector, the backbone of its economy, depended on Chinese rare earths. Toyota, Honda, Sony, Panasonic, all of them held hostage by a fishing dispute. Japan released the captain within weeks. Stage 2 complete. The test had been run. The leverage was real. The outcome was exactly what Beijing calculated. Nobody in Washington took it as seriously as they should have, because it happened to Japan, not America, and because the minerals with the strange names dysprosium, terbium, neodymium did not make for compelling cable news television. Check, verified, undeniable. The year is 2025. Donald Trump imposes sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods. China does not respond with tariffs alone. It reaches for its deepest leverage. In April 2025, the Ministry of Commerce introduces export licensing requirements on 7 critical rare earth elements. 16 American entities, almost entirely in defense and aerospace, are placed on an export control list, cutting them off from Chinese supply entirely. American manufacturers begin shutting down production lines, not threatening to shut them down, actually shutting them down. Defense contractors unable to source the materials for guided missile systems, jet engine magnets, and radar components. The Pentagon describes it internally as a national security emergency. Stage 3 arrives. The chokehold begins. A temporary truce is negotiated in November 2025. China agrees to suspend the most severe restrictions for exactly 1 year. In exchange, the United States suspends certain semiconductor export controls. Both sides call it a confidence-building measure. Both sides know it is a pause, not a resolution. The truce expires November 10th, 2026. And as of this week, 2 weeks into March 2026, American companies are still reporting severe supply disruptions. China is issuing export licenses slowly, selectively, unpredictably, demonstrating deliberately that even during the truce period, Beijing retains full discretionary control over whether American manufacturers receive what they need. This is not a truce. This is an extended demonstration of leverage. Stage 3 is not over. It is ongoing right now. And stage for the extraction of concessions is what November 2026 is designed to accelerate. Check, verified, undeniable. Now let me tell you exactly what comes next, because the pattern is specific, the historical precedent is documented, and the outcome is more predictable than most people are willing to accept. November 10th, 2026 is not just a date on a calendar, it is a deadline that Beijing calibrated deliberately. It falls after the U.S. midterm elections in November 2026, which means any administration concessions made to extend the truce will be politically constrained by domestic electoral calculations. It falls 8 months from now, long enough for American dependency to feel stable and comfortable again, short enough that no meaningful alternative supply chain can be built in the interim. CSIS confirmed this month that there is currently zero heavy rare earth separation happening in the United States. Zero. The one facility that processes some rare earths MP materials in Mountain Pass, California, handles light rare earths, the heavy rare earths that go into the most advanced military and technology applications. Have no domestic processing alternative, none. The expert quoted by the South China Morning Post this week was blunt. There is no immediate broad-based solution except supply loosening in China. Read that sentence again. The United States, the most technologically advanced military power in history, has no solution to this problem except asking China to be generous. That is stage 3 completing itself. That is the chokehold doing exactly what it was designed to do. Now let me address the 3 objections that always come up at this point, because they are always the same and they always underestimate what is actually happening. The first objection is that the United States is already building alternative supply chains, that the investments in Mountain Pass, in Australian partnerships, in rare earth projects across Canada and Africa will reduce dependence on China within a few years. This argument is true in its timeline and dangerously wrong in its urgency. Yes, alternative supply is being built. The Trump administration has committed $1 billion to an Australian reframework. MP Materials is expanding. Linus USA is building a refinery in Texas. These are real investments. But here is what every analyst who tracks this sector is saying. Those projects will not produce meaningful alternative supply before the mid-2030s at the earliest. The metallurgy is complex, permitting takes years, building processing capacity from scratch for elements that require highly specialized refining takes a decade, not months. The 1-year truce buys the United States approximately 0 additional processing capacity. The November 2026 expiration arrives before a single alternative processing ton has come online. Beijing knows this. The truce was not designed to give America time to build alternatives. It was designed to demonstrate that the deadline is real and the alternatives are not ready. The second objection is that China needs American markets too. That mutual economic dependence means Beijing will never actually pull the trigger on a full rare earth embargo because it would hurt China's own manufacturers. Japan used to believe this in 2010. The Chinese fishing trawler captain was released in weeks. Yes, China's rare earth producers suffer when export controls limit sales. Yes, China's midstream manufacturers absorb some of the pain. But here is what the analysis from War on the Rocks published in January 2026 makes clear. China has calculated that it can absorb the domestic cost of using this leverage. The strategic gains, concessions on semiconductors, Taiwan-adjacent policy, and technology transfer agreements are worth the domestic economic friction. China is not running a profit-maximizing corporation. It is running a state strategy. Profit and loss are not the primary calculation. Strategic position is. The third objection is that the U.S. can simply substitute or do without these materials. There is no substitute for dysprosium in high-performance permanent magnets operating at high temperatures. There is no substitute for terbium in certain optical applications. There is no substitute for neodymium in the most powerful magnets used in wind turbines, electric vehicles, and military systems. These elements exist at the intersection of physics and chemistry in ways that do not have engineering workarounds. The F-35 fighter jet contains approximately 920 pounds of rare earth materials per aircraft. It cannot be redesigned around their absence. The guided missiles in America's arsenal use rare earth components in their precision guidance systems. They cannot be substituted out. This is why Jamie Dimon called it painfully clear. It was not a diplomatic assessment. It was a description of an emergency. So what does this mean for your money, specifically starting today? First, understand what November 2026 actually is. It is not a negotiating deadline. It is a pressure point that Beijing has built into the calendar to extract maximum concessions at a moment of maximum American political vulnerability right after midterm elections, before alternative supply exists, with us defense manufacturers unable to scale production without Chinese inputs. Every policy decision the United States makes between now and November is being made in the shadow of this deadline. Trade negotiations, semiconductor export rules, Taiwan posture, all of it is being negotiated against the background of this expiring truce. If you want to understand why the Trump administration has been inconsistent on China policy this year, harder in some areas, softer in others, this deadline explains the pattern. Second, look at what sophisticated money is already doing. Rare earth company stocks have not just risen, they have surged. MP Materials shares are up 480% since the start of the year. USA Rare Earth rose 19% in a single day following China's October announcement. Critical Metals Corp jumped 55%. These are not speculative moves. These are institutional investors pricing in a structural shift in who controls the inputs to the modern economy. The Pentagon is stockpiling. JP Morgan is deploying $1.5 trillion. These are not the actions of institutions that think the situation will resolve easily. Third, understand the second-order effects on the industries you already own. Every electric vehicle manufacturer has exposure to rare earth supply chains. Every defense contractor, every semiconductor company that uses rare earth inputs in advanced chip manufacturing, every wind and solar energy company, these are not niche exposures. They are embedded in the largest, most widely held equity positions in the world. An S&P 500 index fund has rare earth supply chain exposure in its technology sector holdings, its consumer discretionary holdings, its industrial holdings, and its energy holdings simultaneously. Understanding where that exposure sits is not exotic. Portfolio analysis. It is basic risk management in 2026. Fourth, think about the countries that benefit from this disruption. The United States is in emergency mode trying to build alternative supply from Australia, Canada, and select African and Southeast Asian nations. Those nations and their equity markets are beneficiaries of a structural shift that is now locked in regardless of how November 2026 resolves. The U.S.-Australia Rare Earth Framework alone commits $1 billion in financing within 6 months. Malaysia, home to the only operational heavy rare earth supply chain outside China, has signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States. These are not small diplomatic gestures. They are the beginning of a multi-decade restructuring of the global critical minerals supply chain. The early beneficiaries are already identifiable. Fifth, consider what happens in the scenario where November 2026 arrives without a deal, where China re-implements the full export control regime. U.S. defense production slows at the exact moment the Iran war is consuming resources. Technology manufacturing faces input shortages. The political response emergency executive powers, accelerated domestic production subsidies, pressure on allies to choose sides reshapes the geopolitical and economic landscape in ways that affect every asset class you own. Sixth, understand the silver angle specifically. China restricted silver exports in 2026, added tungsten and antimony. This is not separate from the rare earth story. This is the same pattern, the resource monopoly cycle extending itself to additional strategic materials. The materials being restricted follow a consistent logic. They are the inputs that America needs and cannot quickly replace. Silver is used in electrical circuits, batteries, solar cells, and medical instruments. Silver prices have more than doubled this year. The pattern is expanding, not contracting. Seventh, do not mistake the November 2026 truce for a resolution. The expert consensus from CSIS, from War on the Rocks, from industry insiders quoted this week is identical. This is a pause, not a peace. Beijing's objective is not to stop using this leverage. It is to use it more precisely, more sustainably, and more effectively. The licensing system that requires Chinese government approval for every export of controlled rare earths is not being dismantled. It is being refined. The mechanism of control is becoming more sophisticated, not less. Here is the bottom line. 40 years ago, Deng Xiaoping stood in a rare earth mine and announced a strategy. The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. Nobody in Washington listened seriously enough. 14 years ago, China cut rare earth exports to Japan over a fishing trawler. Japan capitulated in weeks. Nobody in Washington moved fast enough. 1 year ago, China imposed export controls and American defense contractors began shutting down production lines. The Pentagon declared an emergency. J.P. Morgan committed $1.5 trillion. The truce was signed for exactly 1 year. That year ends November 10, 2026. The pattern is documented, the mechanism is established, the deadline is set, and as of this week, 8 months out, there is still zero heavy rare earth separation happening in the United States. The people who understand this pattern, who see what November 2026 actually is, are already positioned. The rare earth company stocks tell you that. The J.P. Morgan announcement tells you that. The Pentagon stockpiling tells you that. The 1-year truce that was designed to expire at a moment of maximum American political vulnerability tells you that. The only question that remains is the one that every crisis reduces to eventually. Are you watching the pattern complete itself, or are you ahead of it? Deng Xiaoping announced this strategy in 1992 in public, on the record. The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. It took 30 years, but stage 3 is here. And November 10, 2026 is when China decides how far stage 4 goes. If this analysis gave you a framework for what the rare earth headlines actually mean, subscribe now, because the next video tracks this in real time. We break down exactly which companies, which sectors, and which countries are positioned on the right side of this supply chain restructuring, and we examine what the historical record from the 2010 Japan crisis shows about the speed of stage 4 and who came out ahead. The pattern does not need your permission. It does not require your awareness. It just unfolds. November 10th, 2026 is 8 months away. The clock is running.